So as we all know, Volkswagen engines are notorious for leaking oil. So you would think with me having a freshly built modern Subaru engine that I'd have a nice leak-free Volkswagen, wouldn't you? But sadly not. However, it's not actually anything to do with the engine. Unfortunately, my gearbox is actually the incontinent one. Seems to be leaking oil from around the front nose cone. I've got a pretty good suspicion it's the shift rod seal and bushings are just worn out. But I'm going to pull it out and investigate and hopefully fix it properly. So first thing I've got to do is actually get the engine ripped out, which I'm not going to clog up this video with. If anyone wants to see the process of removing a Subaru motor from a Volkswagen, I've already done a video on it about March of 2011. IRS gearboxes, or double jointed axle, are very simple to pull out. There's a little bit more work involved in a swing axle gearbox, but all that is because the drive axles can't be disconnected from the gearbox easily. The axles and rear brake drums come out with it, so it's only a matter of unbolting the axles from the spring plates so they can come out with, and disconnect the handbrake cables. I'll show that in more detail next time I'm in town. Dad's a swing axle. Anyway, a few important tools for the job needed first, obviously. So here's the most important tool for a IRS gearbox removal. It is a 8mm 12 spline bit bolt removal tool, and the only way to get the CV joint bolts undone, you can't use your regular Allen key or Torx bit or that. It has to be the correct 12 spline or 12 point bit. So that's the first thing I've got to do, is disconnect the CV joints. So with the handbrake firmly applied, you can undo generally about 3 to 4 at a time, and then obviously you can't get to the bottom ones due to the angle of the CV joint, but you can loosen off the top ones, release the handbrake, rotate it, and then get them to the top and undo those as well. So all those bolts are being completely undone, they're just sitting in there now. The CV joint at this point will usually stay pretty well attached depending how long it's been since they've been apart. Mine is fairly loose because it hasn't been apart that long ago, but one of the easiest ways is just get yourself a BFH and gently work around tapping it, and it'll pop off like that. So now the easiest thing to do is tie that axle up out of the way with a plastic bag over the CV joint to keep all the dirt and shit out of the grease. Alright, both drive axles are disconnected and bagged up. Next step is the just undo the wing nut off that clutch cable. Because we're going to be removing the wiring to the starter motor, is to disconnect the battery. Next up is the starter motor wiring. Now there is also wiring on the reverse light switch right up on the front of the nose cone there, but it's very tight to get at, and I usually wait till I've pulled the gearbox out a little bit till I can get to it. Alright, back inside the car again. I've got the cover plate removed that normally covers the coupler inspection poured over. So there's the coupler there, and all it needs is that square headed bolt at the back there undone. Now I can see there's actually a round hole through it. Normally it has a safety wire tied around it so it can't undo itself, but I'm too lazy to do that. Now 8mm spanner fits on it beautifully, and just undo that without dropping it down the black hole. So the coupler's now free. Sometimes you can remove them just by hand, but mine's slowly coming. Another easy way is just grab the gear stick and just wiggle it back towards the back of the car, and off it comes. You can see the little dimple where the locking grub screw drops in. Now the front mounts in these cars changed in 1973. This being 74 has the later type. So to simply remove the gearbox, just needs those two 19mm nuts there, just need to be loosened. They're in a slot so they don't actually need removing. So just need to loosen them. The 72 and earlier ones have two bolts that run horizontally through the rubber, through a flange on the chassis, through the rubber, and then through a mount on the gearbox. So they'll need removing completely. My spare gearboxes here actually have the earlier kind of front mount. That one there's actually a Type 3, which is totally different to a Beetle, but this one here is out of a 71 model 1302 Super Bug. So you can see it has the flange with the two studs which protrude out of the chassis instead of the slotted ones like my Bug has. Alright, so next up there's just the ground strap just there that runs from the chassis down to one of the front studs on the gearbox. So the 13mm nut on the top there is the easiest to undo. So all I've got left now is the two 20mm bolts that hold the gearbox cradle to the chassis forks on either side, and the reverse light wires. So before you can remove those two bolts there, obviously, I've got the jack just taking the weight gently of the gearbox. So I'll pop those two bolts out now, slide the gearbox back a couple of inches so I can reach in then and remove the reverse light wires. Alright, that's all done, so now the fun part is just juggling it out of there. They do not balance well on a jack, so I'm not going to try this one-handed. Alright, so there it is out. And it's leaking from two obvious areas. The main offender is actually the reverse light switch. I did buy a new one for it, because this one, whilst it still works, where the plastic centre connects to the crimps into the outer part is all loose, so that's why it's puking oil out. And the other area that's leaking quite badly is out of the shift rod housing. There is a lot of play in that, and the bushing and seal just can't keep up, so it leaks all the oil out and it's running down underneath, probably eating up my rubber mount there. So to fix that little problem, I've just bought a new bushing and seal kit. You can see the front one, it's all one piece with the brass bushing and the seal in it. So First thing I'll have to do is remove that nose cone. So I've got the old bushings out. Front one wasn't too bad, just gripped it with the pliers and twisted it and it came out, but this inner bushing, shit me dead, that was a right bastard of a job to get out. Absolutely mutilated it, as you can see. Trying to push it out because it's so thin, there's just no sort of shoulder to push on, so it deformed quite a bit. And equally as traumatic was getting the new one in. I'm thinking it may actually need a little bit of a hone because the rod is just a little bit tight in there. That one bashed in nice and easy. So just do that and it's right to go back on. So the flange area on the gearbox is all nice and cleaned up, as well as the nose cone. And if I was doing this properly, I'd track down a proper paper gasket for it, but this gearbox will need a tear down in the near future because the bearings are getting noisy, so I'll just use sealant. So one of the important things when using sealant is not to block this little track here up. So if you pile it on really thick here, you got to be careful that it doesn't block that hole there up, which is the breather. Otherwise it'll start spewing oil out all sorts of crevices. So get all that cleaned up and a bit of Celastic on it and bolt it back together. Nice good coating ready to go. And I guess the final step before you put the nose cone down fully is to make sure that the hockey stick engages properly with the selector forks. If it jumps out, you'll have to pull the nose cone off and reposition it. So it's best to stick it right up proud like that and lower it down slowly so you can watch that it stays in position. Well, it's all bolted back together and right to go back in. I'm not going to bother filming putting it back in. There's nothing to it. It's just reverse of pulling it out basically. But all you do is just guide the two slots there into mounting bolts at the front there, and lift it up into place and get those big bolts in the chassis forks. And just bolt everything back together, nothing to it.